All right, let's go. 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second episode of Semitic Sundays. I'm your co-host, Elijah Kallenberg, with
Jad Hashem.
And today we have two special guests. But before I describe who they are, I want to say this episode is sponsored by Atidna International, the first and only student organization dedicated to free and open conversations about Israel-Palestine on college campuses. Our two guests today are Ali and Emma, both UT students. Ali is a student in the LBJ school, and Emma is a student in the law school, and they respectively lead the Atidna branches of the LBJ school and UT Law School. Ali, Emma, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, let's get right into it. The first topic for discussion, as it's been in the news cycle for the past week or so, is the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. I just want to pose an initial question. What are any initial thoughts you have? What will be the reverberations on the region, and what can we expect going forward, specifically with Iran, because of this assassination on their soil? Either of you are free to start.
I mean, I think personally, we were in the middle of escalations as it was. Obviously, it's going to make things worse, but then I think on the other hand, you can say this is a strong showing from Israel of saying we're not going to allow further escalation. I don't know if it necessarily will be read that way, but I can understand why it was seen as a necessary move. But as it is, it feels like everything that we see is just further escalation. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure that escalation ever really will lead to peace. But as far as escalation goes, it's not the worst escalation I've seen. But obviously, I'm coming from a more, I hate to say pro any side. I'm pro peace at the end of the day. But I do strongly respect Israel's right to exist. And so I can understand where they were coming from with that move. But I'm not sure if I'm not sure how good it'll end up being.
I think the typical Israeli claim for an attack like this is to reinstitute their deterrence capabilities, which they believe they lost after October 7th. So do you think that an attack like this does that, or does it say, no, Iran needs to have a strong response, specifically one that penetrates the Iron Dome, attacks infrastructure in Israel to make a point which could lead to further escalation with proxies in the region? Do you think it will lead to deterrence or escalation, in your opinion?
I think honestly, it's they're taking a gamble essentially, where the idea is Iran doesn't want a war, and they are betting on Iran not eventually wanting to escalate. I think there are concerns about what's going on in Iran itself, with citizens not being happy with government there. So I think there's some argument to be made that Iran can't risk really going to war because that will only escalate their internal tensions. And so if you believe that, then you could say that it's ultimately the best move to say we're not taking any trying to come up with something other than a curse word, you know? But at the end of the day, it is a risk, and it's not necessarily one that we are going to be able to, well, we're going to see what's going to happen essentially at this point.
Yeah. Ali, I want to...
Emma,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. To respond to Emma, I mean, Emma made a point about that it's potentially not going to escalate significantly. And I mean, this isn't the first assassination of top Hamas leader. You know, remember back in January, was that Hamas leader that was assassinated, but the bombardment was the same as it was after. And so after the strike, I think that there is this potential of escalation, not with Iran. The reason is because during Trump's presidency, of course, he struck Soleimani. Iran said that they were going to have a swift revenge, basically. And Iraq was also part of that as well. But there was some skirmishes on Beirut and Syria. and that is seeing that there's that potential of escalation in those close neighbors.
Hmm.
The bombardment has still been the same. Just yesterday, there was a strike in a hospital, in Oscar Martyr Hospital, and then tents. They have not announced how many have died, but it just shows that even with this precision strike, their bombardment on Gaza is not going to end. It's not going to slow down, and it does impair negotiations. Now it's going to lead to the organization Hamas and its other entities to create delegates to do so, or um, they won't do so.
Hmm.
That's the issue, because they're more hardline. So when you have one person that was in the negotiations of a ceasefire, hostage trades, and de-escalating essentially, um, or if that, I don't think that word was used, but that's effectively a ceasefire. Uh, you remove him from the equation. That just eliminates any kind. Well, it's going to further reduce the chance of getting to a ceasefire and easing tensions.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's my thoughts.
Yeah, well
I
said.
think, oh,
And sorry, go ahead, Yellen. Yeah.
oh, well, I think like the one thing that I would respond to that is that I think there were concerns that the leadership as it was had no interest in a ceasefire and was more interested in um, stretching negotiations out. Like I know that I just don't know that we really had a ceasefire even with him in the room, you know?
And
So
that,
I think that
but
there's some idea
That
that if you scatter it, you can have somebody come forward to say, I'll take over. I don't know.
to
But
clarify, you're talking about specifically Hania, correct? Not Israel. All right.
yes, yeah, with yes.
Ali,
I'm
I
not sure I might have missed something
yeah.
in the breaking up.
I'll respond to that and say that that is not true. I mean, we have heard multiple times from different news sources, especially news sources from within Israel, like the Times of Israel, and Haaretz, saying that Hamas was putting forward a ceasefire negotiation, even what was it, 2, 3 weeks after the
So I
October
think
7th attacks.
the issue is that
So,
the proposals that were being put forward ended with them still in power, and that is not, I think that what happens with them still in power is just another October 7th is the issue. So while those proposals were for a ceasefire generally, they're a ceasefire that just sets them up to then attack again in the future. And I think that was ultimately why those weren't really taken seriously as ceasefire proposals, because it was essentially you leave us alone and we're going to come back in a couple of years, if that.
but they also, well, they also accepted Joe Biden's proposal for a ceasefire, which I believe also would limit Hamas significantly. I think it favors Israel a lot more. They even mentioned that it was Israel's plan, um, but
But I
it was
think that
rejected by Israel. If remember, like
I'm,
that was. I mean, Joe Biden did discuss it. So if we want to talk about something that even Hamas accepted, the ceasefire plan proposed by Joe Biden would effectively mean that like Hamas would not have a lot of power, but it was rejected by Israel. So I don't know if that
I don't think
would
it was ultimately rejected by Israel. If I recall, what happened was that the negotiations became very publicized, whether or not they'd be accepted. And ultimately, neither side seemed to really. There was agreement from the war cabinet, and then the war cabinet dissolved in Israel. And then my understanding is that I don't think that there was agreement of we'll accept this deal if also these additional things from the Hamas side. So I think it wasn't necessarily that that sort of just fell apart was my understanding.
So let me jump in here before I let Jad take over because I know Jad definitely has some thoughts on this. Um, One factor that I think is needs to be said in this discussion is Benjamin Netanyahu versus the military establishment and versus the war cabinet. Because I think Benjamin Netanyahu himself has had pressure internally to accept the ceasefire, but he has tried to change the ceasefire multiple times in Qatar, Egypt, and other people have called him out, and he's been called out within his own government and within the defense establishment of Israel. But Jad, I want to hear your thoughts on this topic. Talk about Biden's ceasefire deal, whether Hamas or Israel is the main impediment. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. There are some things I agree with from each of what Ali and Emma have said. First and foremost, I will say I don't think the assassination of Hania benefits Israel almost at all. I mean, Elijah, I'll give you kind of your own sort of question here, but 20 years ago when Ahmed Yassin was assassinated, did that make Hamas any weaker?
Not at all.
No,
No, just
not
bolstered.
at all. It's
Yeah.
grown significantly, right? And Ahmed Yassin, it basically looks like an angel compared to some of the people in power now.
Yeah.
Um, Not to mention, obviously, it's not just Hania, but you had Mohammed Deif, who was killed, Aruri, who was killed in January, as Ali mentioned. You had Isa, who was killed as well. I mean, really, Sinwar is the one out of the major five that is still around, and he's obviously the mostly known as the mastermind behind October the 7th. He's the head of the sort of what we would call the terrorist regimes of the brigades and everything like that, and in charge of the forceful nature of Hamas, besides just the political nature of it.
Hmm.
I do want to say something about Biden's ceasefire deal, and I think this needs to be acknowledged. When that was proposed in April, or excuse me, in May, there were a few things that were noted. I remember Reuters specifically mentioned that Hamas viewed it very favorably. But also, I want to mention, and Elijah and I have spoken about this, that in the deal, in the third phase of that deal, Gaza was to be put under, once there was going to be a removal of Israeli presence, as in, soldiers fighting in the area, but also moving away, presumably getting rid of the blockade. It was to put Gaza under a 3 to 5 year humanitarian situation, which was to see Gaza uh, basically run, but more so the word they used was overseen by the United Nations, Qatar, and Egypt. Those were the groups that were supposed to then look over Gaza. So actually, in the deal, the third phase of that deal was supposed to demilitarize the Gaza Strip. And what we have heard, I think, is whether or not that was to be accepted and whether or not Hamas was going to remain in power. I think the United Nations would have stepped up in that role. And obviously, Egypt has been a country that obviously has recognized Israel. Qatar is a very close ally to the United States in certain areas. These are two countries that have connections to Western nations, and with the United Nations, I think that it's very fair to say that the ceasefire deal actually would have demilitarized Gaza to prevent something like October 7th happening again. But I don't think the assassination of Hania obviously benefits really anybody. Obviously, at the end of the day, I'm also very concerned about the hostages that are still being kept. You obviously need a ceasefire deal for that. The families of the hostages are the ones who oftentimes get a lot of scrutiny from Netanyahu and his coalition, even though they're the ones demanding the ceasefire deal. Um, and of course, we obviously have to acknowledge the fact that, for Hamas to get out of power, there has to be a lot of fundamental change that happens in Gaza. You have to end the blockade. You have to allow for the people of Gaza, I think, to also have their elections. I'm going to be honest for a second, and maybe this is controversial, but I think that the governing body in Gaza must be chosen by the Palestinians in Gaza. It's not up to the United States or Israel or the United Nations to tell the Palestinians who serves them. That being said, I do approve of the sort of discretionary approach of saying the United Nations will watch over Gaza to make sure that it is rebuilt, right? And the ceasefire deal, which I really can appreciate, actually talks a lot about the day after, right? So it talks about the 3 to 5 year rehabilitation process in Gaza, demilitarizing the strip, even with Hamas presumably still being a political entity in the area. Not to mention, of course, even with the assassination of Hania, we know roughly 70% of Hamas infrastructure is still intact. Odds are there are more Hamas fighters today than there were on October the 7th. We have many reports about the Israeli army being low on resources and many of their own soldiers being killed in this conflict, obviously. I just think it's a complete loss for Israel. And I don't think that any of their citizens should really be too thrilled about this because it's going to lead to further escalation. And let's also be honest here. Israel wants Israel wants Iran to get involved in this, so it pulls the United States into this as well. That's kind of been the goal for a while, presumably. And I think that with the United States, now you see, I mean, they're literally, going to be putting soldiers on the ground, it looks like, in the Middle East, their own soldiers. I think Israel kind of, Israel obviously knew what this was going to look like. And I think we're seeing a regional war fully expand here. And I think it's very dangerous for everybody. And so obviously I'm not a fan of Ismail Haniyeh. I don't think he was a good person. I don't think he was a good political leader or a good military leader. I think that he harmed both Palestinians and Israelis, obviously. And he certainly had at least some knowledge of October the 7th, despite what he has to say. I mean, he was someone who still mentioned a day or so after that it was, he basically rationalized with it one way or the other, even if he was not the leading military figure in that, obviously. But, even if Sinwar gets assassinated, for example, and here's another thing I should mention. The way Hamas is built, it's very decentralized as well. It is made so that you don't need your top leader.
I was going to say that. Thank you, Jod. I was going to
It's
say
very
that. Thank you
decentralized.
so much.
It doesn't rely on a top power, and I said, when you eliminated Ahmed Yassin 20 years ago, that, I mean, completely backfired in Israel, right? I mean, now you have the Palestinians who are more willing to elect Hamas, obviously. And by the way, the majority of Palestinians in Gaza seemingly disapprove of Hamas and want a two-state solution. But I think they also see Hamas as the people who are willing to fight for them in this case, even if it obviously involves killing innocent Israelis, which I completely disapprove of. So,
can I push back a
yes.
little bit on the idea that Israel wants a regional war? Because I
Sure.
think I would disagree, because I understand where you're connecting those dots, right? You think if Iran is involved, the US is more likely to come to Israel's defense. But I think ultimately, if you are familiar with military operations, it's not worth it. It's never going to be worth it, particularly when you think about this axis of resistance. Iran means China means Russia. Nobody wants to create essentially World War III, particularly when these are all nuclear powers at this point. So I think that there is some, so the reason that I push back is because I think it's worth thinking of it more from the strongman perspective. Not to say that the strongman perspective is one that's worth holding, but it's the one that Netanyahu is working from. So from his perspective, he thinks we kill this big leader, they're easily fractured. We get somebody to the table who is willing to negotiate. We get some change in the power system to where somebody is willing to negotiate. So I think that which is not to say necessarily, obviously that's the best possible read, but that's also something that's worth considering when you think about where people are coming from and when we're thinking about how a negotiation works and how we conduct a negotiation, thinking about like assuming the absolute worst and the other party isn't usually the best way to get to that point. And so that's the only reason that I say that, even because I think otherwise you've got a lot of great things that you've said, and I don't want to discount any of that. It's more just when we think about when we're thinking about the negotiation, it's the same sort of, it's like how you want to give the very best point of view to people in Gaza and to Palestinians. It can be useful if we take a step back from thinking about the other party as the absolute worst possible goal, which in my mind would be World War III, but maybe you weren't thinking as far as World War III. But,
Now, Emma, I have a question for you. So I think one of the common claims is it's not necessarily Israel or specifically the Israeli military establishment that wants this war. I think they understand the risk that you're saying. I think it's solely geared towards Bibi Netanyahu that this claim is leveraged against. Typically, they say he wants to avoid jail time because they know his corruption will be front and center as soon as this war ends. So he's trying to prolong his tenure in office as much as possible, and a war will definitely do that because he knows he will probably go to jail at the end of this. So what is your pushback specifically to the notion that maybe not Israeli society or specifically the Israeli military or defense establishment wants this war, but it's Netanyahu that is trying to foment tensions on its border with Hezbollah. They're trying to poke Iran as much as they can. And he knows, and I think Joe Biden knows because he called him out and said, this is bullshit that you want a ceasefire. I think it was today or yesterday that was leaked, right, Jad?
That was, I think, this morning, perhaps.
Was this morning? So
And
what,
they've
what
been
do you-
having problems for a long time that's been going. So yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I
Go ahead,
know
go
what
ahead. Yeah.
I think absolutely Netanyahu, I often say he's the Israeli version of Trump. He is very likely going to be facing these corruption charges after the war is over, and he absolutely knows that. My response is just that it's a government, it's not a dictatorship. And as much as he is an authoritarian strongman, he doesn't have the end all be all say about military operations. He can put a huge wrench in ceasefire negotiations, which we see with his public talk and just generally how he's been engaging with the ceasefire negotiations. That's very obvious that he is not interested in a ceasefire. And that's part of why I say, like, let's not assume the worst, because just because they've got like the worst person possible as the head of state right now, it doesn't mean it's that everybody in the state is awful, although, they have it's definitely not all winners. I'm not gonna, but I think ultimately, yeah, it's just that the government's not just one person making all these calls, and Netanyahu might be able to say in the news, "I want to start World War III," but at the end of the day, he doesn't get to decide what military moves are made. I mean, he's got some say, but he's not the head of the IDF or anything like that. So,
Yeah, Jack, do you wanna jump in?
I'll say something, and then I want to get Ali back in this, of course, and then we'll probably end up switching gears to another topic here. I actually agree with Emma on this, and I agree with Elijah as well. I want to clarify for one thing I said. I don't think the Israeli military wants this to go on. I think very clearly they acknowledge the fact that this is probably a lost war. I mean, we've seen many quotes, for example, from former heads of the Mossad, former intelligence operators for the IDF, saying this is a war that basically we have there is no clear goal here. If you want to defeat Hamas, obviously it's just almost impossible militarily to be doing that, especially with infrastructure and leadership and all this stuff. I also think Sinwar obviously knows that if this war ends, he also will be going to jail, just like Netanyahu. I think they both have the same sort of thing in their head of they know that they're going to be in very big trouble once this ends. And the Israeli military, I don't think wants this to go on. Obviously, the Palestinians don't want this to go on. I think most Israelis don't even really want this to go on, even though they obviously think of the going after the terrorist groups as a positive. I think a lot of them also understand that just diplomatically, some of this is also very risky. Getting the hostages back, I think, should be the number one goal for both parties in this, and then obviously seeing a de-escalation in Gaza. But I do want to get Ali back on this, and then I think we'll switch gears after that.
Yeah, sure. Al, any thoughts you have?
Yeah, just I'm gonna keep it short and brief. Let's talk about two things. One, Emma, you raised a point about saying that not most of the government of Israel believes in what Netanyahu believes, but it is a bit scary that his top officials are kind of more bloodthirsty than he is. You have Ben Gurion and you have Gallant, and their operations has been very, very devastating. And I think like when you have those top officials influencing you, I don't. It's hard for me to say that like the only significant person in the government is just Netanyahu. That's just not true. I think it's been full consent from a lot of officials in the government that they want to effectively expand and even then go into the West Bank as well. It also is just very, very difficult when you are doing this protracted war that affects the hostages as well. And I think that the bombardment has been on the same as it was before, but the casualties have now gone on to include natural disasters as well. And so that's what I wanted to say about that. And I think the second part, the second thing that I do want to say is that what was my second part? I'll just leave it at that. I think I'll just leave it at that for now, and we'll move on.
I think you bring. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's very fair, and it's absolutely true. He's not alone. That's what I was alluding to, I said they're definitely not all all good. But I think what it reminds me of, honestly, is you remember when Stephen Miller was Donald Trump's national policy advisor? So I
Mhm.
do kind of contextualize this in the Trump presidency, and I try to remember how horrible a lot of our very public officials were during that period, and hopefully
Yeah.
will not ever be again. But it is unfortunately part of a democracy is that you can have ideologues, you can have right-wing ideologues, genocidal maniacs. Stephen Miller is a white nationalist who is himself. I mean, I'm not going to go out saying he's genocidal because I don't have that fact right in front of me, but I mean, I don't have much respect for white nationalists. I hope that doesn't get me canceled. That would be weird. I take that back.
Oh,
Sorry.
don't say weird. Don't say weird. They don't
Oh
like
wait.
that.
Yeah,
That's right.
that would be weird. They would cancel. That would be so weird of them to cancel me for saying that. Anyway, of the Republicans. Anyway,
I think it's good that we're talking a little bit also about comparisons to America, because in the recent media coverage of Israel, we've had what's being compared to Israel's equivalent of January the 6th. I'm sure all three of you have heard that far-right demonstrators with, I believe, some far-right members of Knesset. I think Zvi Sukkot was one of them. And it was, of course, under the protection of Ben Gvir, since he's in charge of the police, and he did not stop this from occurring. Raided two military bases that were holding IDF soldiers that were accused of torture and sexual assault of Palestinian prisoners. And so my question is, an event like that is showing the deep cracks within Israeli society, the deep divisions. And some people are saying that this is on the verge of a civil war even. And so I want to know, Ali, Emma, when we're talking specifically about the context of ceasefire, these negotiations, is it structural? Is it Netanyahu? Do you see that being any sort of reflection upon that? Do you view these impediments to regional peace within Israel's political context specifically as something ingrained, something that needs to be addressed with the far right? How does this all play into that? I'm curious.
I'll answer that since Emma, you answered first time, so I'll answer the first time. So with this, my thought is I think of it as like a the actions of Israel external turning inward, and it's showing like a crack and crumbling in its own construction, and effectively like the project of Israel for a while. I mean, if you think about it, a good comparison would be South Africa, and during its moments of effectively, and this is stated by the ICJ. This is stated as a fact by law. If we take law as an objective truth, thus by objective truth, it is operating in apartheid. We're at the last moments of South Africa's apartheid. There were many of these societal crumbling, and we are seeing that happen within Israel. What we've seen before in the past in Israel's existence is, of course, a very structured operations of a lot of things during its history, and of course with the existence of PFLP and PLO, right? But a lot of it was very structured actions.
Hmm.
What we're seeing now is it's reaching its sort of inflection point or critical condition of its existence, and everything is sort of turning inward. Um, Now, that is to say that this may not be the only one. There may be more critical conditions that happen. I mean, it happens with every country and every nation. It happens in the United States. It happens in Europe. And as you continue to be a country, you have those critical conditions. But I think, what's so specific or what's special with Israel is the fact that we are in this moment where its creation is much similar to that of South Africa, much like the Berlin Wall. I think it's reaching a moment where it's going to effectively crumble its structure, and we have to see what happens after. And I think some speculate a civil war. Some speculate that perhaps there's going to be not a critical condition that would happen. I think it's just these are moments, much like January 6th. These are just moments. But I think it's going to showcase like what is going to be the next move. Are we going to see something like a governmental restructuring, right? Are we going to see the UN stepping in? Are we going to see those remnants of, let's say, Rhodesia turning into Zimbabwe, or South Africa de-apartheiding, if that's what they said, but do we see, or desegregating, do we see that happening, or do we see a civil war?
So
I think that's what we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, Emma, please
I
respond.
think so. There are a couple of things. Just off the bat, real quick. Law is not objective fact. Law is typically politics, and legal rulings are typically a manipulation of past politics onto future politics. This is how it works in sort of, oh my dog. Okay, this is how it works in any sort of, oh Lord. I'm gonna let them stop barking. I don't know if y'all crop these at all. If not,
No, it's okay. You'll be
We can
good.
do that. Yeah, you're fine.
okay. They're still. Can y'all hear it?
Yeah, no, I can't hear anything. No background noise.
Oh,
I can't hear anything.
You can't hear it. Okay, cool. There you go.
Yeah, we can't hear it. It's fine.
Okay. Law is essentially a collection of historical decisions. So what we have is case law that you use to build a case, and it's based on what previous judges have decided, and it's typically not really based in facts that you present, but a lot of times facts can be excluded or included on not necessarily arbitrary but bureaucratic reasons. So all this to say, my number one advice for anybody considering law school is to not consider a judge to be the absolute arbiter of truth, because they're typically operating on their own agendas, and that's the case here in the US. That's pretty much the case anywhere that operates under the Roman legal system, which includes Israel. Stop. You gotta hush. Thank you. Okay.
Now, leaving that all back, I'm sure you've read the ICJ's ruling about Israel being accused of apartheid. Their occupation is illegal and they have to withdraw settlers immediately. So are you saying that ruling specifically is politically motivated? Is it not inherently based in fact? What's your opinion on the ICJ ruling specifically?
So I think specifically as to the apartheid claim, my understanding is that was a separate ruling, and that was a reasonable basis grounds, which essentially is an indication that they should look a little bit further into it. It's saying this could be the case, so we need to keep looking. And the reasonable basis grounds ruling did rely on the assumption that Israel is intentionally hitting civilian areas and not targeting Hamas operatives, which I don't know if we really have evidence for that, which might be why that hasn't gone much further. But they did find, and as far as the occupation ruling, that's a separate thing. Occupation, absolutely, there is an occupation. And personally, I think that the occupation, like even from a strictly selfish standpoint, isn't a good move for national security. So, hush. So, essentially, my point here is that apartheid is actually a crime on one's own citizens. So while there may be crimes occurring within the occupation, that's a separate issue from apartheid itself. Apartheid would be, I remember at the Peter Barnard interview, what I found particularly compelling was the argument that the restrictions on who can lease land in Israel constitutes apartheid. And I think that while that's compelling, that also means we need to understand a country like the US also to be an apartheid state, and pretty much every country on the planet potentially, which isn't necessarily something that we should not do. We should strive to eliminate all forms of systemic discrimination, but ultimately, apartheid is an internal crime, was the point of that.
So
And that's not to say it's not bad. It's just to say that when things have, like, words have meaning sort of thing. But
I have a question. I have a question for you based on that. So I think the charge that the ICJ claims is that although Palestinians in the West Bank are not Israeli citizens, they say that Israel's occupation has become de facto annexation almost, and that there is one state from the river to the sea and it's Israeli governed and Israeli controlled. And because of that, they have an obligation to those people as if they were their citizens. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but because that's the basis of the ruling that it's technically is internal, like the West Bank counts as an internal fact on the ground of Israel itself at this point, does that meet the threshold then for apartheid, or do you think that part of the ICJ's ruling is incorrect?
I think so. If this is within the occupation ruling, I might have missed that part. So I would have, is this talking about specifically where the IDF is controlling areas near settlement towns?
It's basic, from what I understood from the ruling, and you can correct me if this is completely off, but because the occupation has no intent to end, the settler expansion has not been mitigated in any fashion. The fact on the ground is de facto annexation. It's not de jure, right? Although Smoltrich recently said that he wants to make it de jure by shifting control of the West Bank from military hands to civilian hands. At this point, because it's been in perpetuity, it counts de facto annexation. And so what the ICJ claimed is that there is one state from the river to the sea, and it's Israel, basically, in terms of legal status, in their opinion. And so based on that, the actions in the West Bank would therefore be considered internal. And so I'm asking, do you disagree with that specific concept, that there really isn't one state from the river to the sea, and that's an unfair charge by the ICJ? But if that's not what the ICJ is saying, and Ali, feel free to jump in as well.
I think that, oh, I don't know what they're working at. I think that that's interesting, an interesting proposition. I think that the Palestinian Authority might be offended by that, but I guess it's a fairly novel situation, and the I can see that there's like,
Are you saying the settlements are?
The settlements
no,
in Area C, so that is under Israeli control, and I think that is a part of their ruling because Israel does control security apparatus in the Jordan Valley, so they control the borders at least, and they have settlements within the West Bank. So it seems like there is internal and border control of the West Bank. I'm not sure if they're specifically referencing areas A and B, which at least have security control by the PA. But
Okay.
I think just in terms of borders from the river to the sea, in terms of borders and from internal presence, they do say that Israel basically controls what goes in and out of the West Bank to some degree. They have internal military presence in the West Bank, and so that constitutes de facto annexation to a degree, because it's also been occurring in perpetuity. It's not just there was a defensive war and then there was facts on the ground for a short period. It's been since 1967. This is the reality on the ground. So they're saying this is, of course, not building up to pull out of the West Bank. This is building up for probably de jure annexation in the near future.
I'm looking at the ruling to try and see if they are specific to the section C. I think that's interesting. I think there are more grounds for the areas that are actually under IDF control. But I don't think that that's a horrible. Sorry, y'all. I've gotten super distracted by all the dog noise.
If it makes you feel any better, we cannot hear it at all.
Actually, I think that makes me feel worse. That means I just seem crazy. But what was
We can't hear, so we can keep talking.
Okay.
It's all good.
Okay, so the I think that's interesting. I think that as far as the West Bank goes, the settlements are a huge issue, as we're seeing with like the Israel's January 6th thing, like the flashpoint there where the West Bank IDF. I mean, there have been some atrocities in the West Bank committed by IDF soldiers, and I am grateful for instances where the law is upheld by Israel in those cases, but clearly we're seeing I mean, what I think is not so much, well, I think it could be the start of a civil war, but I don't think it's necessarily the result of, I don't think the internal issues are necessarily so much the result of this issue in particular. My understanding is right now we're seeing a lot of what's called hybrid warfare, which is online warfare, essentially. That sounds a little silly, but essentially, Russia has what are called troll farms. Are y'all aware of this?
Yeah.
Where the whole goal is to normalize certain opinions and rhetoric and make it so that people, it's basically to sow discord within countries. The US just shut down, I think, 9 of these. The DOJ put out a news release about it about a week ago. And I'm gonna go find, it's a bot farm, I think is what they called it. But yeah, there was a covert Russian government operated social media bot farm that was targeting the US, and they seized domains, and there were like at least 1,000 bots where they shut them down. I'll just send this in here. So I think that what we're seeing in Western countries is a pretty distinct effort to create internal strife and to make people angry at one another. And I would be shocked if Israel were immune to those efforts, particularly given that there's such a flashpoint in the Russia, like what we're currently seeing between the US and Russia with this, I mean, new Cold War almost. So I think that personally, if they are seeing what we're seeing, their crazies are being told that they're right, and they're being told that they're many, and they're being told that they should act and that they should escalate. So I don't think that necessarily it's a sign of anything related to the conflict itself so much as a sign related to the new forms of warfare that we're seeing in this internet age. But, you know, that's just based on what the US has recently discovered. And, you know, personally, my connecting the dots essentially. So I might be wrong.
I'm sorry. Because I feel like you have this. I feel like you.
Ollie, I don't want to cut you off, but you have a robot voice right now, and we can't really understand you the best.
Sorry.
No, still can hear you.
It's tough to hear you right now. I guess I'll jump in very briefly. Hopefully, we can get you fixed. I will just say there's a lot to say. I mean, first and foremost, obviously, I agree with the ICJ. The ICJ got this right. It was apparent to literally everybody that Israel, obviously, is illegally occupying Palestinian land. It's known as the Occupied Palestinian Territories for a reason, the OPT, even Gaza. I think the ICJ kind of makes a point that Gaza is under somewhat of a de facto occupation for the fact that Israel obviously controls much of what goes in and out of Gaza, even though Israel doesn't.
Not occupation, de facto annexation, you mean, right?
Sorry, yes, annexation. De facto annexation of the land, because obviously Israel has control of a lot of what's going on there, specifically the blockade. But also, you know, we have to be very honest, I think, with how Israel conducts its manner. I've said for a long time that obviously I think any sovereign nation, which includes Israel, should have the proper right to defend themselves against threats. But obviously, the way that Israel has done it has been gross. I mean, look at what every human rights organization in the world has said, whether you're looking at Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they both have classified Israel's system of segregation and discrimination in the West Bank as apartheid, particularly for the simple fact that in the West Bank, Israelis basically live under civilian law. Palestinians more or less live under military law. My father experienced that firsthand. He was born in 1966 and lived practically his entire life under occupation. You can also ask many Palestinians who have lived in the West Bank, and it is this literal military law that you live under, and that's been well documented as well. Not to mention when it comes to something like the targeting of civilians, you have, for example, Relief Web, you have the International Committee of the Red Cross that have well documented this as well, talking about innocent civilians who have been specifically targeted. We've even heard from Jewish American doctors who have talked about kids being shot point blank without even there being really a question as to it being deliberately done. Obviously, we also have reason to believe that Israel is using starvation as a weapon against the people of Gaza, whether it be cutting off food and water, whether also be cutting off technology and electricity for people to communicate with one another. not to mention the fact that Israel obviously tells Palestinians to evacuate to humanitarian safe zones. They then bomb the safe zones. Israel has repeatedly targeted and forcefully used their presence in refugee camps. They've done this also many times without having any sort of reasoning of doing so. They've also been caught lying multiple times about quote unquote Hamas tunnels being under a lot of this infrastructure. In fact, some of the tunnels have actually even been built by Israel themselves, and that got caught. And you had actually former leaders admit this as well. Of course, obviously, this goes into again the fact that Netanyahu has prided himself on propping up Hamas multiple times. He is somebody who's prided himself on stopping the Oslo Accords from actually being fulfilled. He's prided himself on stopping a two-state solution. You even have obviously organizations like Breaking the Silence, that is an Israeli-led organization of ex-IDF soldiers who have documented things that they have been told, such as the fact that they get to shoot at pretty much anything that moves. They've been told that when they're bored, they shoot. You have video footage, obviously, of Israeli soldiers going into homes, putting on women's lingerie of civilians that they've forced out, laying in cribs of homes. You obviously have video footage of Israeli soldiers celebrating their birthday by blowing up apartment buildings and laughing about it. You have Israeli soldiers that chant all sorts of things about death to Arabs. You have leaders in Israel society who document the fact that in the first week of October 7th, talking about the fact that there's no such thing as an innocent person in Gaza. There actually have been hostages as well. I don't remember the lady's name, but one of the more notable hostages who was released fairly early on, she even said that she didn't believe that there was such thing as an innocent Palestinian in Gaza when she was released. And of course, that part of that is from trauma, of course. But that's, that's something that she said that she felt very strongly about, which obviously I'm disappointed in.
Do you mind
Yes?
if I say, so I think
You also
I think that what we're dealing with in this conflict is a lot of footage and imagery that we get put in front of our face every day of the other side, quote unquote, doing the worst things imaginable. So I think as much as you, and this is like, I am not, I don't want to push back and say like, I don't know how much of this footage is true, how much of it is stuff that has been AI generated at this point, which is not to say that any of that of what you just listed was. But what my point is more so is that what I have noticed is that you can find somebody who has been traumatized and turned into the worst person possible and will say the worst thing imaginable about the other side, quote unquote, and you can make that into an argument for your side about why everybody needs to die on the other side. And I think that we see a lot of that on both quote unquote sides, right? I think that, I mean, in we'll say pro-Israel circles, you can see all sorts of footage of horrible things. And I don't think that there's value necessarily in focusing on that when we have the actual, like, I think that what we saw with the protests at UT in the spring was a dismantlement of the ceasefire negotiations. Not just at UT, but across the US, we saw the messaging change from ceasefire now to boycott, divest, sanctions. And from that, we see the escalation on both sides because we've gone from we're working together for a ceasefire to actually we're going to take down one side here, right? So when we choose one side like that, when we say, oh, it's not ceasefire anymore, it's BDS, even though there are ceasefire negotiations ongoing, we're going to suck up all of the air out of the room away from the ceasefire negotiations. We're going to take all the pressure away from a ceasefire, and we're going to bring all of this energy into this pro-Hamas side, which is not to say that all of the protests, which is to say, honestly, most of the protesters were not pro-Hamas. I just don't think that they understood what they were doing to the ceasefire negotiations when they were doing that. So it's like, basically, if we just spend all of our time in tit for tat, we're never going to get to peace. That's the point. That's all, which is the only reason why, because I feel like, and I could feel your energy and I can feel like how painful that is. And the only reason I just kind of wanted to bust out of focusing on the pain a little bit so we could talk a little bit about, what is the solution? Does that make sense? Sorry to
I want to let Ali jump in because we cut him off earlier. But yeah, go ahead.
Do I still have a robotic voice?
No, you're
Do I
good.
still have a robotic
Go
voice?
Go off, my man.
Okay. So, well, I'm gonna push back on that. I think I'm gonna hit multiple different points here. I'm gonna move on from my previous point. When you're talking about doctor images, you gave a vapid answer, but I won't jump into that answer because I feel like you're trying to push into saying that Iran is pushing videos. But I'm not gonna touch on that. I'm gonna let that go, and I'm gonna move forward and talk about the protests. I don't
That was not my
think that the
point, just to
protests.
clarify.
Um,
My point was
but
just
okay,
it
so
doesn't help anything.
yeah, I know. I left. That's why I left that claim because I think we just move on from that
But
one and
I'm
then
just
talk
saying,
about
don't,
the
but you're
protest.
throwing
I
out
think
here an
that
accusation that I'm coming
okay,
from the worst place. So I just want to say I'm not coming from the worst place. I just want to say that since, you know, if you're throwing that out there, I feel like I have the right to engage with it. So
I mean that's why I kind of reduced that claim because I'm not touching on that anymore. I think that the main focus the answer that you gave me, for that, then I guess I'll touch up on is the fact that we have information produced that even the president was claiming that simply wasn't true. If you remember the multiple claims that was talked about, um, especially when it came to the beheaded babies, that claim was false. You had the president, and I think there is this information that's a significant agent in attacking information. And when it came to the student protests, I completely disagree in saying that it sucked up the air on the ceasefire. It was mainly discussing colleges' investments. I don't just see how that college protests would lead to ceasefires ending. I mean, you even have Netanyahu claiming that a lot of them are pro Hamas supporters when there were multiple Jewish students. We have Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, that were joining this protest, and they've been at the forefront of it, and they've been significant in conversation. I mean, they are pushing for a ceasefire. They say ceasefire now, and the fact is that they're saying that what they were doing because they wanted a ceasefire, and they also wanted to reduce the weapons manufacturing, sending billions of dollars to them, is saying that they just sucked out the air of a ceasefire. Like a bunch of college students protesting about this. That's saying that basically that.
Can I explain why?
Saying in this, let me finish my point.
Sure.
Well, let me finish my point first. It's like saying that stuck air for the Civil Rights Act because of what they. I just simply don't believe that, and that's what I'm gonna end on, and I'll let you respond.
So my point with that is that when we look at the timing of the negotiations and the timing of these protests, well, I think that a lot of the people who were protesting really cared and really were interested in a ceasefire. The messaging, all it did was put one side on edge and on the defense and the other side on the offensive. We see the Houthis in Yemen carrying around the banner with the UT student on the, oh, is this, okay. We see the, sorry, we see the issue with the Houthis carrying around the banner with the UT student on it. We see Sinwar saying that he feels like he's winning the war during these, as these protests are ongoing. And I really don't think that the intent was to suck up the air, and I don't think that the intent was to distract from the ceasefire negotiations for most of the people attending. But I do think that, especially with the organizations at UT who are organizing these, we have people retweeting Hamas stuff on October 7th, around October 7th, retweeting stuff like new map just dropped, and it's the attack on October 6th that came out of the the Palestinian Solidarity Committee, which was, not very appropriate. And then these are the people in charge, and the timing along with the substance matter, I just strongly I don't believe that anybody who was interested in supporting the ceasefire negotiations would have made the call to change the messaging when they did. It doesn't make sense, and it didn't make sense for a negotiation. And it didn't make sense for ending the war. And I think it could have been very well that it was just a mistake, but I think ultimately it was a mistake that really torpedoed the ceasefire negotiations at the end of the day.
All right. I just want to clarify, we have 5 minutes left, so I want to transition to our final topic, and that is vice presidential candidates for Kamala Harris, if that's all right with all of you. I know it's
Yes.
getting there, which is okay. We encourage any and all discussion. This episode is sponsored by Atidna, so we like this kind of stuff.
That's right.
I do want to talk about Kamala real quick. So the odds are, what we're hearing out of Vegas, out of expert pundits, is that it will likely be Josh Shapiro who will be her vice presidential pick. And there has been pushback from progressive groups. I think the nickname or trend on Twitter recently was Genocide Josh, after comments resurfaced of him in college calling Palestinians I think the term was battle heavy people who are unable to run their own
Govern
state.
themselves.
Yeah. And so
I
I
think it was.
Thank you, Alex. And so I just want to ask, are the criticisms from progressives well-founded? Is this because he's the only Jewish candidate in the race? There has been accusations leveled at Pete Buttigieg for being overtly pro-Israel. Mark Kelly, another individual in the running, recently met with Netanyahu when he was in Washington. He has not received the same kind of pushback. So my question to Ali and Emma, are these criticisms well-founded? Is he generally probably the worst person in this race on Palestine? Or is it because he's Jewish? Is this people creating an enemy out of someone who should not be created out of? And so I'm just interested on both of your takes real quick in the little time we have left. And Ali, feel free to start since Emma started the last one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some say it's Jover, but it's just commencing. So I throw that out there. But for the VP pick, I think let's look at it as let's talk domestic first. I think it's important to talk domestic first of who would be the best pick. I think that Colin was trying to go for was someone that I think would be more favorable for people. That I think people can support and has strong stances on things that are domestic issues. She wants to kind of find a strong person that people can support. I mean, if you look at like what Joe Biden did in the beginning, he picked someone that I think would be favorable for a lot of people in terms of like getting that the minority votes, right? Getting those minority votes. And that's what was really important for him. So that's why he picked Kamala. I think he saw from that. I think if we look at it from an aesthetic standpoint, that's what we looked at. But also is the fact is that Kamala Harris seems to be less of a, I guess, problematic pick. If we wanna look at that.
Sure.
But sorry, I heard someone talk. I don't know.
No, you're good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, if you want to look at it that from that standpoint, but I mean, like from a lot of times you look at a lot of their track records from different people. I think, but Pete Buttigieg, I think, is one of the person who's lacking the most. So I don't think that would be a pick. I think that would be.
Ali, I think we've lost you, my
I
guy.
kind of look at it from the aesthetic standpoint. Aesthetic standpoints, I think that they would look at seeing that he is from a minority group. Now, as far as it goes to discussion, I think we've seen that both of them have a strong stance in standing with Israel, and I think that a lot of the criticisms fared. I think that Josh Shapiro hasn't left those ideas. He may be less aggressive than he was in college, but this is just to show that less aggressive than he was in college, but I think he still is a big supporter of Israel. Now, let's say that is he going to be more proactive than say Joe Biden? in trying to end the war and create a ceasefire. I think we'll see. But domestically, he seems pretty favorable for a lot of people.
Yeah. And Emma, off to you. What do you think about Josh Shapiro? Do you think the criticisms of his stance on Palestine are valid? Do you think he's changed since high school? I saw another person point out that he honored the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is a Pennsylvanian or was a Pennsylvanian, and so they're saying, oh, he's in bed with some far right Israeli figures. So what's your take on the situation?
Well, I hope everybody's changed since high school. I'll start with that. And I do, I don't know, because ultimately I don't think the vice president is going to have, I suppose, as a public figure, they'll have some sort of involvement in ceasefire negotiations. But I think ultimately, I think we're going to see Mark Kelly as the pick. I don't think that, yeah, I know. I just don't think that Jews are white enough. Like, I don't think we're white enough for America to count as like the white guy diversity hire that Kamala needs at this point, because I do think that's what she ultimately needs for the VP pick. So I think like setting aside whether or not the genocide Josh stuff is anti-Semitic, which I mean, personally, I do. It's honestly, if anything, it's lazy because they added an extra consonant sound onto Joe. So, but yeah, I think ultimately, Shapiro may not be the pick, for completely internal domestic issues. Which
And it is interesting. And before I let Jad have the last word on this, Kamala's team did say that Shapiro's Jewishness would be taken into consideration. So that's it's definitely playing into what you're saying. I don't think a Jewish public figure is probably the most popular in many respects, sadly. But that's just how politics works. But yeah, Jad.
Well, I do think that Josh Shapiro will be the pick. I also think strategically it's the best pick in terms of winning the election. Pennsylvania is obviously a state that is the most important probably to win. Personally speaking, I want Tim Walz to be the VP pick. I think he's a fantastic governor. I like his track record a lot on progressive issues. I will say on Israel-Palestine, I think he's by far the best. He is someone who called for a ceasefire very early on. He is somebody who condemned the October 7th attacks, but has repeatedly said that the casualties and Palestinian civilians must end. He is somebody who has been harsh on Netanyahu. And he's also somebody who actually showed quite a bit of sympathy for the protesters on college campuses, saying that they deserve to be heard. I think that he is also not a bad pick strategy-wise. Obviously, Minnesota is not exactly a battleground state. Kamala should be able to win it fairly comfortably. But I think that Tim Walz, I mean, listen, if you're looking for just kind of an ordinary, older white guy, I mean, he's like 60 years old. He's a former football coach, even like, I mean, if you want to try to appeal to some Americans, maybe that's something you can do. He also has pretty high favorability in Minnesota overall, even especially amongst independent voters. Someone like Andy Bashir, I'm not interested in personally. I know he's pretty progressive, but I don't want somebody from Kentucky on the ticket. I don't think it's strategic at all. I think it'll be Shapiro. I do think that Shapiro has changed. He is somebody who was very quick to criticize Netanyahu back in November. He also has been for a ceasefire. I do disagree with a lot of his stances on the issue, particularly because he has been someone who has sought to punish universities who have divested. And I disagree with that personally. But I don't think Shapiro. I think Shapiro. I would much rather him be the pick over Mark Kelly, considering Mark Kelly went to the Netanyahu speech and applauded him pretty loosely. So Walz would be my number one, and then Shapiro would be number two. But I think it will be Shapiro. But I'm going to cross my fingers for Governor Walz instead.
And that is all the time we have. We're right at the 1 hour mark. Ali, Emma, thank you so much for joining us. This was our second episode of Semitic Sundays. Tune in next week for another episode, and thank you all. Have a great one. Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you very much.